So there's three themes that I want to share with you on the Feast of the Assumption. The first one is Xena, the warrior princess. Seriously. The second one is stepping on a snake. And then the third one is leaping for joy. Now first, Xena, the warrior princess. If you're old enough, you'll remember the TV series, Xena, the warrior princess. And when I was a young priest, I lived with an older priest who really enjoyed watching Xena, the warrior princess. And I don't think it was because of the plot. But I would sit down and watch it with him sometimes, and I was actually fascinated. The plot line was pretty good. You have Xena, the warrior princess, and so she's a princess, but she's also a fierce fighter. She's strong, she's confident, she's courageous, and she does battle with the forces of evil. And she's really good with a sword. And she has a sidekick named Gabrielle. Sound vaguely familiar to the angel Gabriel? So Xena does battle with all these forces of evil, and she's confident and victorious. And of course, she protects the weak, and she's really, really ruthless on those who are arrogant. So Xena's kind of cool, but we have something way better. We have Mary, the warrior queen. She's not just a princess, she's a queen. And that's what we see in the first reading, because the first reading from the book of Revelation at first can feel a little scary. Revelation sometimes is hard to make sense of, but it starts with a vision of the temple in heaven, of God's heavenly temple. And in it, we see the image of the Ark of the Covenant. Now remember, the Ark of the Covenant is what the Israelites carried with them through their journeys in the desert, and the Ten Commandments were inside the Ark of the Covenant, a sign of God's presence with his people. But as a warrior queen, Mary also does battle with the forces of evil. And we see that in the first reading, because first we see the image of Mary, and then we see this dragon with 7 heads that's attempting to do harm to the child that's to be born. And of course, the child is snatched away to safety, just as God snatched Jesus away to safety from death because of the resurrection. And so we see that Mary is a fierce warrior. And not only is she a fierce warrior, but she doesn't have to use the weapons of the world. Now, Xena, she was pretty good with a sword, and she did a great job with a sword, but Mary has stuff way better than a sword. She has the weapons of spiritual warfare. And that's why oftentimes when you see a statue of Mary, you'll see her standing on a snake. Now, I don't know about you, but I have kind of a visceral reaction when I see a snake. If I'm out in the woods hiking and I see a snake, I suddenly learn how to fly. I don't like snakes, and I think all of us don't like snakes. We just have this instinctive reaction to a snake. Even if it's just a little black garden snake, it still causes this little panic inside of us. And of course, I think that's because the serpent or the snake always represents for us those forces of evil. And what are the weapons of the forces of evil? Well, the two big things are death and sin, right? Death and sin are the scariest things that we face. That which can kill our bodies and that which can kill our souls. And so Mary has a different set of weapons. Her weapons are first the weapon of humility. Because what was the original sin of Adam and Eve? The sin of pride. Adam and Eve did not feel confident enough in God, and so they attempted to become God themselves. Their sin of pride is what led to the downfall of humanity. And so Mary, in her humility, is the antidote to the pride of Adam and Eve. She's the antidote to that original sin, because in her humility, she lacks no confidence in God's ability to provide for her, in God's ability to care for her. The other weapon that Mary wields is the weapon of being open, willingness. You see, most sin, if we think it through a little bit, is in the will. It's in what we choose. A lot of times we think it's in our actions. We focus on the outward actions that we do, and we see sin in actions, and that's true, but sin begins in the will. It begins in what we choose. When we choose something that is lesser than God and elevate it above God. That's when we sin, when we choose selfishness instead of generosity, when we choose fear instead of love. The choices that we make are often what lead to sin. And Mary, rather than being willful and choosing herself, is willing and chooses what God chooses. She chooses the will of God in her life, even though she's not sure what that will look like. She doesn't see the future. She doesn't know how following God's will change her life. She knows that it will change her life, but she is willing to trust in God. And then, of course, the other weapon that Mary wields is that weapon of pondering. That might not sound very weaponized, but pondering is different than just stewing over something. There's all kinds of times in our lives when we stew over something. We just have a thought in our head and we keep stewing and stewing. That's not Mary. Mary ponders. In fact, we hear that in Scripture, that she had all of these experiences in her life and she pondered on them in her heart. Now, pondering is not an easy thing because it really is taking the experiences of our days and trying to understand them. And most of the time, the way we approach that is we go through a day and we stop at the end of the day and we think, how could I have done that day better? What could I have done differently? What would have made the day look better? Pondering is different. Pondering starts with the question of, where was God present in my day? What was God inviting me to do during this day? How is God inviting me to engage tomorrow in a different way? That's pondering. Pondering leads us to a very different place. Instead of just focusing on ourselves and our efforts, we begin first by asking the question of, what does God want of me? Where is God active and involved in my daily life? That's pondering. That's a powerful weapon, because with those weapons, we can absolutely fight the forces of evil. And that's what leads us into the gospel. In the gospel reading, we again have this beautiful scene. We're in the Judean hillside. Mary goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth in the Judean hillside, and it's just outside of Jerusalem. And scripturally, another very important event happened in the Judean hillside. That's where David went and brought the Ark of the Covenant from the Judean hillside into the holy city of Jerusalem. And he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem so that God would bless the holy city. And inside the Ark, of course, were the 10 Commandments, some of the manna from the wanderings in the desert, and other artifacts reminding the people of God's presence with them. And David was so excited about the Ark of the Covenant that as he led the procession into the city of Jerusalem, he danced before it with wild abandon. In fact, so much so his wife thought he made a fool of himself, but he didn't care. David was so excited because he was dancing before the Lord. He was leaping before the Lord. And that's exactly what we see in the gospel today. Mary greets Elizabeth, and John the Baptist, in the womb of his mother Elizabeth, leaps for joy in the presence of the Lord, just as King David did. And not only does he leap for joy, but then that initiates Mary's Magnificat. And that's why I say sometimes our image of Mary's docility fails to recognize the power of Mary, because Mary, as a warrior queen, is ready to take on those who are proud. She's ready to take on those who exploit the weak. She's ready to take on those who have gained so much wealth for themselves and forgotten about the poor. And in her Magnificat, Mary is essentially laying out a declaration of war, a declaration of how God intends to turn things upside down, that he takes the smallest, most insignificant girl in the Middle East and turns her into the Queen Mother of God. And so today we celebrate the Assumption of Mary. And our dogma sometimes can sound a little dry, but it's really important for us because our dogma says that Mary was assumed body and soul into heaven. Not just soul. It wasn't just that Mary escaped this world, but she was assumed body and soul. And that's why the church proclaimed this dogma right at the end of World War II, because it wanted to remind us that we are called to live in this world. We are called as Christians to engage actively in spiritual warfare against the forces of evil, not with weapons of violence, but with weapons of spiritual battle, the weapon of humility, the weapon of being willing to do God's will, the weapon of pondering on the role of God in our daily living. And it's with those weapons that we actively engage in this world and prepare ourselves for the next world, to prepare ourselves for the eternity that God desires for us, for the vision of the heavenly Jerusalem. And so today we celebrate not only Mary's role in our lives, but Mary's role in salvation history as that warrior queen who encourages us to do battle with evil,